Picture a normal apartment building in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 1991. 3 floors. Thin walls. Neighbors who nod at each other in the hallway and don't ask too many questions. On the second floor, apartment 213, lives a quiet man in his early 30s. He works at a chocolate factory. He keeps odd hours. Sometimes there's a smell coming from his unit, the kind of smell that neighbors mention to each other and then decide is probably just garbage or something he forgot to throw out. Sometimes there are sounds. But this is an apartment building. There are always sounds. And nobody knocks on the door of a quiet man who keeps to himself to ask what's happening inside. That quiet man's name was Jeffrey Dahmer. And inside apartment 213, right there, behind a door any of his neighbors could have knocked on, was evidence of 17 murders. 17. Committed over a period of 13 years. In multiple apartments, in multiple cities, but mostly right there. In that building. Next to people who had no idea. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His early childhood, by most accounts, was unremarkable. His father was a chemistry student who later became a research chemist. His mother struggled with mental health issues and required significant medication. The household was tense. His parents fought constantly and eventually divorced when Jeffrey was 18. But here's what investigators and psychologists who studied his case kept returning to. There were signs. Not obvious signs. Not the kind that trigger intervention. But signs. As a child, Dahmer developed an unusual fixation on dead animals. He would collect roadkill, dissect it, preserve bones and body parts in jars. His father, a chemist, initially saw this as scientific curiosity and even taught him some basic techniques for bleaching and preserving bones. That detail is not a comfortable one. He was a deeply isolated child, awkward socially, drinking heavily by his mid-teens, a habit that would follow him for the rest of his life. He graduated high school in 1978, and this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because just weeks after his high school graduation, while his father was in the middle of moving out of the family home following the divorce, while his mother had already left with his younger brother, while Jeffrey was alone in an empty house for the first time, he committed his first murder. A hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, 18 years old. Dahmer later said he invited Hicks back to the house because he didn't want him to leave. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer killed him. He was 18 years old. And then he buried the body in the backyard, dug it up months later, crushed the bones, and scattered them in the woods behind the house. And nobody knew. Not his father. Not his mother. Not the investigators who eventually looked into Stephen Hicks's disappearance. Nobody. For 9 years, that murder existed only inside Jeffrey Dahmer's head. He drifted after that. He enrolled in college, dropped out after 1 semester. His father, increasingly alarmed by his drinking, pushed him to enlist in the army. He was sent to Germany. His fellow soldiers later described him as strange, heavy drinking, sometimes aggressive. He was discharged early for alcohol-related conduct issues. He moved to Miami briefly, then back to Ohio, then to Milwaukee, where he moved in with his grandmother. He was arrested twice, once for indecent exposure, once for drugging and sexually assaulting a minor, in the mid-1980s. He received probation. He was not incarcerated. He was assigned a supervision officer. And then, in 1988, he moved into his own apartment. Oxford Apartments, 924 North 25th Street, Milwaukee. Apartment 213. Yeah, the system had multiple opportunities here. And every single one of them closed without doing what it was supposed to do. Because this is where the killing accelerated. Between 1987 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 16 more people. The method followed a pattern he had refined over years. He would approach young men, primarily Black and Latino men, in their teens and 20s, at bars, malls, and bus stops in Milwaukee's neighborhoods. He was not threatening in appearance. He was white, relatively average-looking, soft-spoken. He would offer money, for company, for photographs, for simply coming back to his apartment to hang out and have a drink. Some agreed because they needed the money. Some agreed because he seemed harmless. Once inside apartment 213, he would drug their drinks, typically with sleeping pills, and then, while they were incapacitated, he would kill them. He strangled most of his victims. And then, and this is the part of the case that makes it unlike almost any other, he did not dispose of them quickly. He kept parts of them, photographs, body parts preserved in his refrigerator and freezer, skulls he cleaned and kept. A collection, essentially, assembled inside a two-room apartment in a residential building in the middle of a city. The smell that neighbors mentioned? That was what they were smelling. The sounds they heard? This is what was happening. And now, this is no longer just a crime. This is a sustained reality that existed, physically, feet away from people going about their daily lives for years. Now here's the part that still generates the most anger when people study this case. Because Dahmer almost got caught. Not once. Multiple times. The most significant near miss happened on May 27, 1991. A 14-year-old boy named Konorak Synthesumphone was found wandering the street near Dahmer's apartment. He was disoriented, barely conscious, naked. Two women, Glenda Cleveland and her daughter, called 911. Police responded. Two officers arrived on the scene. Dahmer was also there. He told the officers that Konorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had been drinking, that this was a domestic dispute and Konorak was just intoxicated. The officers, despite the two women insisting that this was a child, that something was clearly wrong, believed Dahmer. They walked Konorak back to apartment 213. They left him there. Glenda Cleveland called the police department back to raise further concern. She was told the situation had been handled. Konorak Synthesumphone was Dahmer's 13th victim. He was killed that same night. And this changes everything about how this case is remembered. Because the failure at that moment was not just procedural. It was a failure shaped by who the victims were and who Dahmer was. The majority of Dahmer's victims were Black or Latino men and boys from lower-income communities. Communities that had documented, historically justified reasons to distrust law enforcement, which made them less likely to report concerns or be believed when they did. Dahmer was a white man in a position to present a credible, calm explanation. The officers made a choice, consciously or not, about whose account to trust. And that choice cost Konorak Synthesumphone his life. It cost 4 more people their lives before Dahmer was finally stopped. The night of July 22, 1991 was the last night Jeffrey Dahmer operated freely. Tracy Edwards, 32 years old, had been lured back to apartment 213 under the same pretense as the others. But something went differently. Dahmer was agitated that night. Distracted. He put handcuffs on Edwards, but wasn't able to fully control him. Edwards managed to punch Dahmer in the face, break free, and run out of the apartment. He flagged down a police car on the street, still wearing one handcuff, and led officers back to the building. Inside apartment 213, officers found photographs. Then they found what was in the refrigerator. Then they found the boxes. One officer, according to reports, ran outside and was sick in the street. The other began making calls. Dahmer was taken into custody without resistance. He sat quietly. He answered questions. He eventually confessed to everything. All 17 murders. In detail. Calmly. By this point, there is no version of this story that the mind processes easily. Because the scale of what had been happening inside that apartment, for years, in a building full of people, in a city, was not the product of chaos or impulse. It was organized, deliberate, sustained, and it had been survivable, structurally, because of a cascade of institutional failures, missed signals, and a set of deeply uncomfortable assumptions about whose safety mattered enough to investigate. Jeffrey Dahmer was charged with 16 counts of murder in Wisconsin. The Hicks murder fell under Ohio jurisdiction and pleaded guilty but insane at trial in January 1992. The jury rejected the insanity defense after 2 weeks. He was convicted on all 16 counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years in total. He was sent to Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate while on a work detail. He was 34 years old. He had served 3 years of his sentence. In the aftermath of his arrest, the families of his victims, many of whom were from the same Milwaukee neighborhoods, many of whom had reported their loved ones missing and felt those reports had not been taken seriously enough, filed lawsuits against the city of Milwaukee over the 1991 incident with Konorak Synthesumphone. The city eventually settled for a total of $850,000, distributed among the families of Dahmer's victims who came after that night. An official acknowledgement, in financial form, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The apartment building itself, Oxford Apartments, was eventually demolished in 1992 after residents and community members pushed for its removal. The lot where it stood remained empty for years. Here's what the Dahmer case forces a serious, uncomfortable conversation about. The first is the psychology of invisibility. Dahmer was not invisible because he was uniquely clever. He was invisible because he fit, precisely, into the category of person that institutions are structured to treat as low risk. Quiet, employed, white, male, lives alone, keeps to himself. That profile, in the absence of specific complaints, generates almost no institutional attention. The second is the failure of the systems that did have contact with him. He was arrested for indecent exposure in 1982. He was charged with second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes in 1988, for drugging and assaulting a 13-year-old boy who was the older brother of Conorak Synthesumphone. He received probation and early release from that charge. His probation officer, in the year before the final arrest, reported that Dahmer was doing well and recommended early termination of supervision. At every point where the system had a reason to look more closely, it looked away. And the third, the most structurally important, is the question of whose disappearances get treated as emergencies. The families of Dahmer's victims made police reports, raised concerns, described loved ones who had gone missing after being last seen in the area where Dahmer operated. The investigative response to those reports was not proportionate to the urgency they represented. That disparity in who gets a full investigation and who gets a form filed is not unique to Milwaukee in 1991. It is a documented, studied feature of how missing persons cases are handled across the United States, and it remains an active policy conversation today. Dahmer's case did not create that problem, but it illustrated it at the highest possible cost in ways that are still being reckoned with. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Not, could you have spotted him? Because the honest answer is probably no, and that's the entire point. The real question is this. When the people who are supposed to catch these things, the police, the probation officers, the systems built specifically to identify danger, when all of those fail, simultaneously, repeatedly, for years, who was actually protecting the people in those Milwaukee neighborhoods? And who should have been? Leave it in the comments. Because that question doesn't have a comfortable answer. And it shouldn't.